Chapter 15. Phony Papers. "What else does the newspaper article say?" Nancy asked Mrs. Mise. The Japanese woman continued to read, then translated. "The police have been unable to locate Mrs. Rossmeyer since the theft. Newsmen and friends have not heard from her either." Mrs. Mise went on reading. "It was conjectured that Mrs. Rossmeyer might have left for the United States. Police and friends have said that oftentimes, on a whim, she would pack up, leave wherever she was, and not tell anyone where she was going. Then suddenly she would turn up in a different country." "She might have gone home to River Heights," Nancy speculated. "One thing we have never asked about is the companion who is said to travel with her. Was she with Mrs. Rossmeyer? Is she mixed up in the jewel racket?" Mr. Mise spoke up. "Would you like me to call the newspaper and ask if they have any information about the woman?" "Please do," Nancy replied. Mr. Mise went to the phone. He returned in a short time to say that when last seen, Mrs. Rossmeyer's companion was with her. "Would you like to go to headquarters and talk to the chief?" "Yes," Nancy and her father replied together. The chief had little to add to the newspaper story, but while his visitors waited, he made a long-distance call to the chief of police in Rome. Then he reported that an investigation had been made, and anyone who might have any information on the jewel theft or the whereabouts of Mrs. Rossmeyer had been questioned thoroughly. "One person overheard the two women talking about returning to the United States," he added. "But someone else had heard them mention that they would go to Paris. Where they went, nobody knows." Nancy asked him what he knew about Worldwide Gem's recent business dealings. When Nancy told of her theory regarding Mrs. Rossmeyer, the chief nodded. "We do not feel that she is involved in any dishonest dealings," he said. "All the information we have collected indicates that Mrs. Rossmeyer is not really active as an officer of Worldwide Gems. It was advantageous for them to use her name, which is synonymous with fine jewelry and good advertising. But we are still investigating all angles." The telephone rang and the chief answered. After a brief conversation, he hung up and said, "I just had a message from Interpol. Someone in your hometown claims to have seen the missing Mr. Moto in the back seat of an automobile. The police strongly suspect that he never left River Heights." Nancy and her father looked at each other. "I had almost come to the same conclusion," she said. After thanking the chief, they drove back to the Mise home. Mrs. Mise had a message for Mr. Drew. His office had called and indicated that it was important for him to return home as soon as possible. "In view of what we just heard at headquarters," Mr. Drew said to Nancy, "I don't think it would be worthwhile for you to stay either. Both Mr. Moto and Mrs. Rossmeyer are obviously not in Japan, and I don't believe you can do any more to locate Mr. Caputi than the police can." Nancy agreed. She felt it was more important to follow the clue to Mr. Moto, who, she was convinced now, was being held against his will by someone in his hometown. Also, in the back of her mind was the statement from Bess and George that Ned, Bert, and Dave were coming to visit the girls in River Heights. "Maybe they can help us hunt," she thought. The Drews told their hosts that they were planning to leave the following day. "Oh, we must have a farewell party," Mrs. Mise said at once. "That's very sweet of you," Nancy said, "but it is not necessary. Anyway, we are not giving you enough time to plan anything." Mrs. Mise said, "Perhaps, as you say, there is not enough time to invite friends, but I suggest that we go to Mr. Mise's club this evening. It has a very fine restaurant, and I think you will enjoy the food there." The club proved to be not only an excellent place to eat, but it was filled with many interesting art objects. A lovely Japanese girl named Lei greeted them. She wore a beautiful flowered satin kimono with a contrasting obi. She had a very fetching high hairdo accented by combs. Lei showed them several charming old pictures of Japanese life as it was hundreds of years ago. Mr. Drew was particularly interested in pictures of old-time Japanese fishermen using the cormorant bird to make their catch. They held the bird like a kite on a string. When the cormorant swooped down to the water and scooped up a fish in its bill, the fishermen would quickly pull it in and take the catch. "The poor cormorant," Nancy said. "He worked so hard for nothing." Their guide smiled. "I venture to say that the fishermen allowed the birds to have their fill after they did their job." Next to the pictures, Lei showed them jeweled crowns, which she said had been worn by royal children in various countries. She pointed to one, which she said was Russian. Long ago, girls usually married young in that country. The brides were shaved in order to accommodate the crown jewels they would wear, she explained. While the group was eating, the head waiter told Mr. Mise that he had read about the disappearance of Mrs. Tanya Rossmeyer. "She is a member of our club," he remarked. "I hope nothing has happened to her. She was here only a short while ago." "Did she by any chance mention to you where she was going after her visit to Rome?" Mr. Drew inquired. "No, I have no idea. She frequently travels from place to place." When the group arrived home, Nancy and her father packed. They were booked to fly to the United States the following evening. "It's high time we get back and take up our work," the lawyer said. "I can hardly wait," Nancy added. After breakfast, the young detective said she would like to go to the jail and try to talk to Mrs. Caputi. "Maybe if I tell her I know a lot about the jewel thefts, she may break down and confess," Nancy reasoned. "I doubt it," her father said. "But I suppose it's worth a try." Mrs. Mise offered to go along, and when the two arrived, they asked to see the warden. After introducing themselves, they inquired whether it would be possible to speak to Mrs. Caputi. The warden smiled. "So sorry," he said. "Her lawyer came here with certain papers and she was released." "Released?" Nancy exclaimed. She was stunned. "But I'm sure there must be some mistake. Mrs. Caputi's husband is wanted in the United States, and we believe she works with him in committing jewel robberies." The warden shrugged. "I am certain you must be wrong. I told you, her lawyer came here with the papers." "What did he look like?" Nancy asked. "He was tall for a Japanese, and powerfully built. Rather stern-faced, I would say." The truth dawned on the girl detective. What was his name? Mr. Campura. End of chapter 15.